Great, so welcome back. Today we'll be finishing up or talking more about graphs. First about general graphs and then, if we have time, about trees. Any questions for projects or anything we should discuss before we start?
Are you going to have the guest lecture?
Yes, the guest lecture is going to be Thursday. And it's by Jenna Diwasa. It will not be streamed. But she's an excellent speaker. She's given a TED Talk, and she's going to give a similar presentation, I think, here. And she will be talking about molecular animation, like how you can visualize whatever is going on a biomolecular level. Any other questions? Okay, so if not, last time we talked about a little bit of an introduction to graph theory. We played around with different graph visualization approaches. We came up with this node link approach and this matrix approach. Then we talked about applications of graphs, that they're pretty widely, they describe a lot of phenomena in nature and in society and in technology. We talked about biological networks, about social networks, and then we talked about a couple of graph theory fundamentals. I'm going to essentially skip over this now because we already covered that. So today I want to talk about graph and tree visualization. And as in any visualization scenario, what we really care about is what does the data allow us to do and what is the goal and the task of the user. So we always have this dialogue between data and task, and that kind of like decides our graphical representation. And that's of course specifically true for graph visualization. So how do we decide which representation to use for which type of graph in order to achieve which kind of goal are the kinds of questions. And so if you think about graphs, maybe let's think about this together. Like if I have a graph, what are the kinds of questions that I can ask of a graph? Let's say I have a social network of people, of your friends in Facebook.
Is A connected to B?
Exactly. So some questions about connectivity. You could say, are they directly connected? Are they indirectly connected? How far is the distance between those two types? Any other questions that we could see? Could ask of a social network?
How many connections does a node have?
Exactly. How many connections does it have? If you talk about a social network, how many friends does he or she have? So that's the degree of the node. Other questions?
Communities in the graph.
Exactly, communities. Do we have like a tightly interconnected network of friends that are all friends with each other, or is there like a person that connects two different circles of friends? So we have these clusters, communities, cliques, depending on the exact structure or the nomenclature that you want to use. Another question. Like up to this point, we always have asked, all these questions were referring to the topology of the graph, right? How the graph is, how people are connected. But what else could I ask?
Are there any meaningful clusters?
Yes, meaningful clusters, again, some topology based, like similar to what she said earlier. Yep.
Disconnected portions in the graph?
Yeah, can I find like anything that doesn't have any connections? But let's say, what would you like to look for if you want to judge whether like this group of friends is predominantly male or female? You would look at the gender attribute, right? So we also care a lot about the attributes in the graph. We care about age. So for example, we could make an inference that people of the same age are preferentially connected within the social network. So to answer these kinds of questions, we also have to look at attributes of the graph. And so what we, on a high level, distinguish are two types of tasks in graphs. These attribute-based tasks, APT, and then the topology-based tasks. And attribute-based tasks are anything that is related to the connection within the network. Attribute-based tasks are anything that are related to the attributes of the nodes or the edges, and topology-based are anything that are related to the connection within the network. And then we have different like goals essentially. We can try to localize something, find a single or multiple nodes or edges to fulfill a given property. We can ask this both for attributes and for topology. For attributes, we could say find the edge with the maximum edge weight, for example. For topology-based tasks, we can say find all adjacent nodes of a given node. To quantify, if we want to count or estimate a numerical property of the graph, give the number of all nodes would be an attribute-based task. A topology-based task would be give the degree of a node. And I can do something similar for sorting and ordering. For example, enumerate the nodes or edges according to a criterion, sort all edges according to their weight, or traverse the graph starting from a given node. So this distinction between properties about the nodes and the structure of the network is what is important here. And we'll see that there's different visualization techniques that are better for attribute-based tasks, and there's other visualization techniques that are better for topology-based tasks. So we have three types of graph representations. We have explicit layouts, matrix layouts, and implicit layouts. However, implicit layouts are only suitable for a special type of graphs, which are trees. And so the explicit ones are the ones that we are most familiar with, and then we talked about matrices too. So let's start with explicit layouts. In explicit graph representation, we have which we call node link diagrams. A vertex is a point, an edge is a line or an arc. And then we can choose different styles, different ways of styling such a node link layout. We could have a completely free placement of the nodes. In this top example here, we have come up with a layout and we place the nodes so that the structure of the graph is optimally visible. Or well visible, let's say. I could have some restrictions on the placement of my nodes. For example, here in this style layout, I have all the nodes laid out around a circle or all the nodes laid out on a grid. And then to the extreme, we have something which is called a fixed layout, where the nodes are, the position of the nodes are given, and I can only show the edges on top of that. And the common example for that is something on top of, for example, geospatial data, like where do people move, from where do people move. We talked about this when we talked about maps. So what are the criteria for a good node link layout? We definitely want to minimize the edge crossing. We want to minimize the distance of neighboring nodes. We want to minimize the drawing area. We only have like paper or screen of a certain size. We want to have a uniform edge length. We want to minimize edge bends. We want to maximize the angular distance between different edges. We want to have an aspect ratio of about 1. And similar graph structures should also look similar, so we want to have symmetry.
What are bends? Oh.
Bends, like if I have a curved edge, like in this example that I had here, these are curved edges.
Okay.
Or also here, this would be a curved edge because it would be like if I want to connect this node to this node, I would have an ambiguity, like I would essentially wouldn't know whether this is connected to this or it's this to this. So then you need to use curved nodes. And so can anybody spot the problem here? Why is this problematic? Like all of these, I could in theory develop a layout algorithm that optimizes for all of those, could they? No, so they can be conflicting. For example, here we have minimum number of edge crossing versus uniform edge lengths. So this graph can be rendered like this without any edge crossings, but then we have one edge that is a lot longer than the others. But here, by having a similar edge length for all the edges, we have to introduce a crossing. And then we have a trade-off here for space utilization versus symmetry. We want to use maximum space and increase but we also want to have the same types of structure, like here and here, these should look the same. So we have these trade-offs to make when we develop graph layout algorithms. And the classical layout algorithm is this force-directed layout. This is the physics model here. Edges correspond to, like mentally correspond to springs, and vertices are repulsive magnets. And so what happens is that whenever, like all of the nodes repulse each other, but those that are that have an edge, they attract each other. And obviously, the attractive force is much stronger than the repulsive force. And so, what happens? Well, how do I run this algorithm? Well, I initialize, for example, by placing all the vertices randomly on a canvas. And then what we have, like we kind of like try to reach a state of equilibrium. Like we cycle this as an iterative loop, and we optimize this layout and kind of run this simulation until we don't reach where there's no more changes that to be made that improves that reduces the forces that are exerted on this graph. So while we're not in equilibrium, we loop. First we calculate the forces on each vertex, and the forces on each vertex is the sum of the pairwise repulsion of all nodes. So for one node, you simply calculate how far is it away from each of the nodes, and then based on the distance, there is a repulsive force exerted on that node. And then we sum it up with the sum of attractions between connected nodes. And of course, there is like some factors, some constants that you might want to have here. And then you usually also you want to have for the spring forces, for the attraction forces, you probably want to have a logarithmic force, not a linear force. That's just what we found empirically. And so after I've calculated the sum of all of these forces acting on each of these nodes, I move this node by the force that acts on that vertex scaled by some constant. And that is one cycle. So in one cycle, I move every node based on its interaction with every other node. And then forces, like in vertices that have a lot of force exerted on them, because, for example, I have one node that is up there but is very connected to nodes down there. This is going to move a lot towards these other nodes. And that now I keep iterating. I keep running this loop until essentially I have negligible update. I can run like an n number of times, but usually I want to look at some, like that. I want to run this algorithm until nothing changes anymore. So, do you think that this algorithm will find the globally optimal solution?
Depends on where they're randomly placed.
Well, they're randomly placed, right?
So you could find the...
In theory, like in some rare case, it could find an optimal solution, but it's even hard to formulate an optimal solution. It's not deterministic because we randomly initialize, and we don't necessarily find the globally optimal solution with this algorithm. However, it generally produces really good layouts. One of the great properties about it is that it produces uniform edge length. Clusters are commonly visible. These tightly connected clicks are easily visible. As I mentioned, it's not deterministic. One of the big drawbacks is it's computationally expensive. So we have O to n cubed, big O n cubed. And so why is that? We have to do n squared operations in every step because we have for every node, we have to compare to each other node and then also to each node to which it's connected, but what's more important is the repulsive force here. So we have n squared in every single step, and then empirically it takes about n cycles to reach equilibrium. So we have n squared multiplied by n, so we have n cubed as a runtime complexity. So that's not very efficient. That essentially means that on a modern computer, the limit for an interactive representation is about 1,000 nodes. Of course, you can compute a force-directed layout for much larger nodes, for much larger layouts offline. In practice, we also have, like, if you remember the things that we did with D3, we also have things like the damping, center of gravity, and so on. So because, like, as you remember maybe from Carolina's presentation, when we had this force-directed algorithm but didn't like add a force that keeps the graph on the screen, it would simply wander off somewhere off the screen. And so here's a nice website that essentially lets you play with all of these different parameters for the D3 layouts. What you can also see, like it's kind of easy to spot that it's not an optimal layout because you, like if you initialize this, you very often can then drag something around and that changes the layout. So we kind of like modify this layout. So we can shift the center in X or in Y. We can change the strength of the repulsion. We can have a minimum distance, a maximum distance. We can have like this collision that avoids node overlaps. So now I'm actually allowing node overlaps, which isn't a problem in this particular case, but if I were to increase the strength, you would see that I have a lot of node overlaps yet now. But if I, for example, avoid the node overlaps, it's not a stable or not a particularly useful graph in this case, but we see that the node doesn't overlap, the nodes don't overlap. And then we have other things like the force X and the force Y that pulls it towards a specific location and so on. So here you can play with these different parameters of these force-directed layouts. So you've seen this picture or pictures like this. What can you read about this graph from that picture? Like this is actually the protein interaction network in, that's happening in our bodies in the human. So what can you learn from that graph? It's big and complicated, but not much else, right? I don't see any, I see there's like a couple of hubs that are probably something like some chemical compounds like water or something that is super important in many processes. But other than that, I can't really see much, and that's why we call it the giant hairball, because it's reminiscent of just a hairball. And so how can we address this? So there's a couple of approaches of addressing these limitations with respect to the hairballs. The one most important approach, I guess, is some kind of aggregation. So we want to group some kind of clicks in an interesting way. That can be like, that depends a lot on your task. You could say, you could also sample a network. Sampling a network isn't so easy because you can't really randomly pick nodes. Because if you randomly pick nodes, you probably break the graph apart pretty quickly and you can't see the structure so well. So there's methods to sample based on, let's say, the betweenness centrality of the nodes to less likely remove nodes that have a high betweenness centrality. Or there's approaches that calculate the articulation points in a network and always guarantee you to preserve those. So these are kinds of various approaches to sample and aggregate. But we'll talk more about aggregation. But how could I make this, how could I address this scalability problem of the computation is O n cubed problem? So one approach for that is to first cluster the network and then create the layouts only within the clusters. So the idea of this approach here is I take a network, I cluster it, have a number of discrete clusters, and then I limit my computation of the pairwise forces only to those nodes that are within my cluster. And then I globally compute forces between the clusters. But instead of having to compare every node with every other node, I've essentially broken it down to only compare the nodes within the cluster. And so I place this like big meta node, these three big meta nodes, and I do the layouts within them, layouts within them, layouts within them, and then I calculate the global layout. That's one approach to improve the scalability. The other approach is, of course, this abstraction and aggregation. So here we have a network, also again a protein interaction network, that is sampled to include only the most important nodes. Here, like we start out with 30K nodes, then we drill it down to 750 nodes. At 90 nodes, we can start to read the labels, and at 18 nodes, we can see that there is actually quite a bit of structure visible. Then we can make these aggregations dynamically. This is a collapsible force layout implementation, and what we call a supernode is an aggregate of nodes. And I can create these supernodes in various different ways. Here we have a tree, and for a tree that is kind of easy. Like I have this layout, and then I collapse everything under this tree into this little blue supernode. Now I collapse this one, and so we kind of simplify this node and only show the parts that are above that network. And so if I collapse the root, of course, I have only one node left. And completely different layout algorithms are orthogonal layouts. Orthogonal layouts are popular because they humans tend to, like if you ask a human to create a layout, they very often do that in an orthogonal way. It's kind of like a nice approach to organize the edges. And these are widely used in biological networks. In biology, there's a thing called biological pathways that kind of summarize the process of interactions between certain like proteins, metabolites, or even genes. And these are very important to judge, for example, what is going on in the disease or what is going on in the breakdown of sugar in the body or something like that. And these graphs are very commonly drawn by humans. And so this is like such a graph, like a metabolic network that is drawn by a human. And until recently, this was kind of like the best automatic layout algorithm that kind of had a similar approach that drew such an orthogonal layout. But then these guys came up with a layout algorithm that produces these kinds of graphs that look very much like what humans create. And I just wanted to highlight this because this is really a great paper in terms of how they approach this. So it's not like these layout criteria that I mentioned initially with like symmetry and node distance and so on. This is something that we've come up with by thinking about it formally. But what they did is they ran a mechanical Turk study to ask actual humans to lay out a graph. And then they tried to observe what is it that makes a good graph. They also asked, in the second round, they asked other mechanical Turk participants, what is a good layout? And so they kind of did this peer, this crowdsourced study about what makes a good graph. And so they have this, here you see this initial layout that they gave to subjects. Then here's the worst layout that was created by a human. You can see basically that this human hasn't changed that much. Here's the second worst layout that was created by a human. Here's the second best, and here's the best layout created by a human. So you can see that the gamut of how much effort people put into this layout. And here's the previous algorithm, and this is their algorithm. And so for the simple network, there's not much of a difference. For this network, you can see that human-like layouts look quite a lot like this layout that their algorithm produced, versus this traditional algorithm produces a different layout. Or for this structure here, you see these are good human layouts, and this is what their algorithm produces, and so on. And so I really think this was a great approach to study what would we consider as humans to be a great layout, and then they kind of derive from that different factors to do that. It's a pretty complicated algorithm and it's not very fast, but it produces great results. So this is a picture that I've seen on Twitter, and I've actually literally had 4 or 5 people come to me and ask me, hey, I founded this startup, I want to do graph visualization in AR or in VR, and I've seen they brought me demos of their tools, and argued, well, graphs are so hard to visualize, the third dimension is going to make this so much easier. So what do you guys think? I see lots of shaking heads, but why not?
The same problems for visualizing in 3D on a screen, you'll have things get obscured by other nodes obscured by nodes.
Yes, we have
edges are super confusing.
Yes. Why would this is true for AR and VR. Why would you use AR for something like this?
You could actually annotate the nodes like the ones which are in the front and the ones in the back, and then kind of create a difference between both nodes if there's a bit of, like just mentioned, if the nodes in the background are getting obscured by the ones in the front, you could use some form of augmentation and annotation, and then that might help in visualizing them.
So I'm not. Maybe I should take a step back. What is the difference between AR and VR?
What's AR, VR?
What's yeah? So that's what I'm. AR is augmented reality, and VR is virtual reality. And so if you use like a Microsoft HoloLens, you have a projection of a video in a scene that you actually perceive. So for example, or if I wear a Google Glass, some information would be projected into my field of view, while I still can interact with you guys and still see everybody here. VR, I have a completely immersive experience. I essentially move into a virtual environment. And so in augmented reality, I always have background information. In virtual reality, I'm completely immersed. And so what would be a benefit of doing a graph visualization in augmented reality when I have the context of what is going on in the real world?
Others can also see.
Yeah, but you could also make, like others can also see, but only if they wear glasses, right? So you could also make others to be in the same virtual environment as you. So my point is there isn't really any reason of doing that, right? Augmented reality visualization is only relevant when you have something situational. When you want to navigate, for example, it might make sense to show me like an arrow, walk there, or drive there, like directly on the street in front of me. But if I have no spatial context, like the stairs here in the background, they have no meaning for this graph, right? It's essentially clutter. It doesn't really have anything beneficial from it. So there's a lot of hype around AR and VR, and those are cool technologies, but they don't really work. Like there's not a lot of benefit for the kind of topics that we cover in this class. For like abstract visualization that is not in a spatial context. I've had, for example, I saw a project that was really great, an AR visualization project. It was really great. They visualized the progress on a construction site over time. Like where was this wall last December? Something like that of course makes sense. Or let's say temperature over a surface, over a mountain. That makes sense in an AR environment, but usually these kinds of abstract representations don't make sense in AR. And then in VR, we have the traditional problems of 3D, like occlusion, perspective foreshortening. We need lighting, so we can't really reliably use color as an indicator, and so on. And in the end, what you do if you create a three-dimensional layout, you have to somewhere put it in front of you. And so you kind of only create this unintentional projection of the layout. So it's much better to actually think how you project it into 2D rather than doing this just by navigating. Okay, end of AR/VR rant. Now back to other layouts. So these styled and restricted layouts, they're super easy to calculate, obviously, and they can be useful in certain cases. What is important here is the node ordering, and what is a big problem is edge clutter. So here we're showing about 3% of all possible edges, and here we're showing about 6% of all possible edges, and we can see that this is already pretty dense. And so one approach to reduce this clutter is edge bundling. This is a call graph of a software package. So we have a hierarchical structure. This is a top-level module. These are subfolders, and then here we have individual code files. And then we have these lines to show us how those things call each other. So we can see that this area here seems to be the area that is called a lot by other modules. So it's kind of like some very central piece of this code. But still, this is pretty cluttered. And so what could we do? Like some people have developed this nice bundling technique. And so this bundling technique here essentially aggregates the main routes, like essentially shows you kind of highways of where are what are the main highways in this call graph. And so you can see that from here, it kind of like is called a lot by this package up there and by this area and this package down here. And so how does that work? That's maybe something for the whiteboard.
Are those like directed edges in that graph?
It doesn't matter. Yeah, so in this case, I think it's directed edges. But essentially, the trick here is, if you think about it, they have something like this. But the trick is that they have another hierarchy in here. So they have this is like a module, and then we have this larger module, and here there's like individual files. So we have this hierarchy in here. like we could draw a tree down here that essentially, and then connects this here, and then connects some larger part. Let's do this here to the center. Okay, so you kind of like in the background of what we have here, you can see essentially like these are the hierarchy levels, and I can then draw these trees within that circle. And then I can route those edges instead of like when I want to connect this dot here to this dot here. I don't draw the line straight, but I rather use I walk up this tree along the spine of the tree. So from here I would go first here, then here, then here, then here, and then I essentially have this zigzag path through the tree. And then by using some kind of spline with different bundling strength factors, I can create these nice curves. So here's this example. Instead of having the straight connection from P start to P end, instead I walk along this backbone of the tree, and then I route a spline through that backbone. And that is what creates those nice edge bundles. Here is a couple of different betas, these bundling strengths, that essentially influence how tightly the curve snugs to this backbone of the tree. And so if we have a completely relaxed beta, we see that there is these straight lines. And then conversely, if we take the strictest possible approach, we can see that we basically see the structure of the tree. But probably something here in that space seems to be like a reasonable beta. And we can see this dynamically in D3. This is of course implemented in D3. So here is without like beta being 0. Here we have about like a third. Here is about half. And then we can increase the bundling strengths until we essentially see this tree structure in the backbone. So what is the downside of this approach? Does that work for any kind of network? It only works if we have a hierarchical structure behind the network, and like we had this package structure, right, that we could make use of. But people have actually thought about how can you do this for general purpose layouts, and of course this is not so interesting to do for like free layouts where I can position the nodes, because then I can just position the nodes more sensibly. But it's interesting for fixed layouts where I can't vary the position of the node. And so there essentially they developed a force-directed model for these edges, so that each node also, each edge is broken up into segments of a certain length, and then each segment is also attracted by neighboring segments. So they added an additional, let's say, or a force-directed bundling step in this algorithm to produce these kinds of layouts. So compared to, let's say, here, people flying in and out of Los Angeles, instead of having these direct lines, you can, by using just the forces between edge segments, you can create something like this bundled layout here without a hierarchical structure in the backbone. There is a little bit of a controversy. Some people say like this bundling is useless, and others say it is great. There isn't really a definitive user study on that yet. My personal sense is it makes sense to some degree. So these cases are pretty good. I think this is not very convincing in my opinion. So as very often in visualization, the answer is it depends. I've shown you this graph before when we talked about maps. I just wanted to show it again because I think it emphasizes really this aspect of aggregation very well, so that you ask users to select what are the areas that you're interested in, group them in some way, like here the clicks within Washington and the Los Angeles area, the Florida area and New York, and then essentially abstract this complicated graph into something much more simple. And then if you want to see like how does Arizona interact with like the details about Arizona, you can again uncollapse it and then see the connections in detail if you care. For trees, there's lots of layout algorithms for trees. Trees are simpler to lay out usually. Here is 2 different versions of the Rheingold-Tilford layout. I don't want to go into the details. Here we have a linear version and here we have a radial version. Both are actually D3 examples. What would be the advantage of the radial version?
Which one? The one on the left?
The circular.
Takes less space.
Yep, exactly. It takes less space. The tree is kind of obvious to see. The node at the center, the root is kind of is nicely in the center. We also have this like we can kind of infer this is like the first level, second level, third level easily by the circles. What's the big downside?
You have to rotate your head.
Exactly, labels, text labels. So you can either rotate your head or you can try to read upside down, whatever is easier for you. And in trees, it's also easy to manipulate these aggregation levels. And so this is from the mother of all demos. If you remember, I showed this briefly in the very first lecture in the introduction, where Douglas Engelbart in 1968 demonstrated the use of a mouse, the use of video conferencing, of collaborative text editing, but he also demonstrated roll up and drill down tree operations with aggregations. And of course nowadays we're completely used to this. Whenever you use a file browser with a hierarchical tree structure, you can simply click on a folder and it will show you the contents, and then if there's a subfolder you can click on that and it will show you the contents. How do we interact with trees? Like the collapsible aspect is of course important, as I just mentioned, for these kinds of operations where I drill down, as you would do in a file system. And then if you want to compare, like graph or tree comparison is a common problem. So you could ask, for example, a question like, how did my network of friends change over the last 10 years? Or you could ask a question like, I have 2 different algorithms that calculate the tree of life for me. They are slightly different. How do the results compare? And this is like a technique that does the latter.
Scientists are often faced with the task of comparing many similar phylogenies, that is, trees that describe evolutionary relationships between species or genes. Although some sophisticated tools for tree manipulation exist, for instance Maclade as shown here, they are designed for small data sets of dozens or hundreds of nodes, and they have very limited support for comparison between trees. The spread of DNA sequencing is leading biologists toward the creation of much larger trees, thousands of species today, and millions within the coming few years. We present Tree Juxtaposer, a new tree visualization tool supporting scalable comparison and navigation of phylogenetic trees of over 300,000 nodes. Even small trees are hard to compare with visual attention alone. Linked highlighting of nodes and subtrees helps. Perfect matches for named leaves are easy to find, but computing the best corresponding nodes in the interior required a new algorithm that runs in n log n time at start. Highlighting alone can still lead to false negative conclusions. We see 2 leaves highlighted in exactly the same spot on both sides, but their structural relationship to the rest of the tree differs. We can mark the exact place in the tree where structural differences occur, using the results of the corresponding node computation. Subtrees underneath the black edges are guaranteed to be contiguous on both sides. The red edges show where a subtree from one side maps to a non-contiguous area in the other. Mouse over highlighting also allows us to check this property on the fly. Biologists call continuous subtrees a clade, and determining whether a clade in one tree is also a clade in the other is a recurring core question. When comparing these larger trees of 4,000 nodes, automatic detection and marking of structural difference is even more critical. Our new navigation technique, where growing one area leads to shrinking of all other places that don't share the rectangle's horizontal or vertical strip, is a new global focus plus context approach called accordion tree. We can manipulate.
So you get the gist of it. So this is an interesting approach, and also for those people who care about computer graphics, this is actually, I think, the only information visualization paper that was ever published at SIGGRAPH. So also interesting for that, and that because it contains a lot of pretty sophisticated layout algorithms. So let's reflect a little bit on these explicit node link representations. Well, an advantage of it is that they're able to depict all types of graphs. So whether we have simple graphs, directed graphs, we have hypergraphs, we can visualize everything with them. And they can be customized by weighing the layout constraints. They're very well suited for topology-based tasks. I can easily see connections over a longer distance. If a suitable layout is chosen. They are difficult to compute, these layouts. The optimal layout is in NP, and even heuristic approaches are still slow and complex, and it has a tendency to clutter, to create these hairballs, essentially. So, with that, I wanted to do a design critique on graph visualization, and for this you will need your computers because it's an interactive technique about the China power structure. Okay, take a couple of minutes to explore this technique. It's pretty intricate, and then we'll talk about all the different things. Yeah, that doesn't make sense.
First question is what data types
I don't dig it for your board.
You should.
Okay. Good.
So let's talk a little bit about this. Like in this visualization that I'm showing right here, what do we see? What is the data that we have here?
Nodes are people.
So we have people, they're the nodes. And then what are these edges? They're any kind of relationship, right? How these people are connected. And what else? What are the data do we have here? What is the difference between this display? When I click on, maybe zoom in a bit. So what is the difference between this display and this one? Like I'm not changing the nodes, I'm not changing the edges. Why are they different?
Clusters and different.
The clusters are different?
The clusters are based on the family on the first one, right? So
Yeah.
related to it, and the second one's who they have like powerful connections with.
Exactly. So what we have is essentially sets or clusters. It's probably sets. Like this is like a static depiction. Are people in the Politburo or are they part of the Shanghai clique or not? And how do you think, like just looking at these transitions, how is that implemented? It's a force-directed layout, right? The people that are in a certain set are attracted to the central node that represents that set. And so then you kind of get these transitions pretty cheaply. And then there are certain people, like here, we have some people that are not in any of these or in all of these, but that's not completely obvious, but probably not in any of those. So why do you think they're not showing all of the edges here at the same time? Yeah, so they figured it might be way too cluttered. And so when I click on any of those nodes, what happens now? now we have like a massive transition. And what is now the difference here? We switched from a graph representation that gave us an overall structure of the whole network to something that is centered around one particular node. So I have picked here Yang Zemin as my node, my central node, and now I see all of his connections. And what is the difference between like these connections here and these connections here? It's first and second degree connections, right? So this person has a direct connection to all of these people here, and if we hover over those people, we see how they are interconnected with each other as well. I can also still switch these different groupings here, and then explore people like this, and then I can always refocus on any particular person if I want to. So if you look at this next visualization here, this institutional power, what do we see here? What type of network is that? So this is a tree, right? So we see like a pretty traditional tree representation. By these like three power structures: government, party, and military. And then we can look of like what are these formal structures, and then I can drill down into individual like sub like political divisions essentially. I think the interesting piece, the other interesting piece is here, this this career comparison chart. What am I looking at here? So I've highlighted one person. We can see essentially what does this visualization show? Exactly, how they rose through the ranks. And not only that, but also what? How quickly they rose through the ranks, right? Because that's kind of important to judge the future trajectory of like upcoming leaders. So you can see for Xi Jinping that he was pretty young by the time he got onto he came onto the national stage, compared to many other people that got quite a bit older. And then like there is this mandatory retirement age, at least at that time I think it was, of 68 for Politburo members. And so we can look at different people and see how they did their career. Is this still a network visualization? It depends. I think it's probably, like in this case, I would probably not call it a network anymore. It's more like the trajectory of a single person. But it's just like shows you that depending on like this duality between the attributes, that we have super rich attributes about those people that we can look at in a network, but we can also use completely different visualizations to look at them. So what do you think about this visualization? Is it a good visualization? Who found it intuitive? A couple of people here. Any comments?
Certain aspects need a learning curve. You need some time to figure out like what needs to be clicked and where you need to kind of traverse in the space.
Yeah. What do you think was the goal of this project, of this visualization? Was it for like analysts? No, it was for, was it like a news, it was part of a Reuters news article to essentially show the power structure in China. It was aimed at essentially, I would say, an interested but not professional audience, right? Somebody who wants to understand how China works on a political level could go in and look at that and try to learn about it. And it's there's a lot of information in there, right? And it's pretty intricate, and you can play with it for a long time. I think that the visual encodings are mostly pretty well done, so that the individual visualizations are nice. It is a complicated data set, and so I think, yeah, for how hard it is to do this right, I think they did it well. Any other opinions? So that would be a nice class project. So, no, just as a background, this was developed by a startup at that time, Fathom, that's run by Ben Fry, who is a MIT Media Lab graduate, and they build a lot of those like custom visualizations, and they actually didn't use any library here. They implemented everything completely from scratch. So now I wanted to talk a little bit about multivariate graphs. And so we talked about these attribute-based tasks, and now the next couple of minutes I want to talk about how do we deal with networks and attributes. So attributes can influence the topology. So for example, in biology it's quite common to look at these canonical pathways of this is how a process works, but then diseases can modify that process, but we don't really know that in so much detail. So we might want to measure like how active is a particular gene, how active is a particular protein, to see whether downstream processes that are dependent on the gene can still function. Another example would be that the best route when driving somewhere depends on the traffic, right? You care about the attributes along the network. How congested is the street at a certain time? So there is an interdependency of the topology and the attributes very often. And so one of the challenges that we have to deal with is data scale and heterogeneity. For example, in biological experiments, it's common to have data sets with more than 500 experiments for multiple groups and conditions for different types of data. And we kind of need to support these multiple tasks. So we have the exploration of the topology of the networks, and then we also want to explore the attributes of the nodes. And so we have a table about individual nodes, and then we have the network that shows us the relationships. And how can we do both? Like, what would be a simple approach to show whether like something is high or low, or like say these are people and we have age. How could I show that on top of that network? So one obvious thing to do is write color coding. But I could simply color code any of the nodes. But the problem is if I have many node attributes of different types, for example categorical and numerical, and I want to show them at the same time, it's going to be tricky. I can't really do color coding. How could I actually approach this problem? So if I do color coding for one vector that works, but if I have 4 vectors, then it gets hard. And there's people who have tried to do this. And so here we're showing about 8 values on top of these little nodes in little rectangles, but that is tricky. It doesn't really scale. People have tried little pie charts on top of nodes, little bar charts, little line charts, little bar charts with arrow bars, scaled the size, the color, then little disks and nodes and so on. And so all of those have kind of like are limited in scalability. I think it works well for certain classes, like here and in this example above, where I have a limited number of classes. I can use node color to show that. But if I want to show a larger vector of data attributes about a node, it gets really tricky. One approach that we talked about in the past to achieve this is small multiples. So I can show the same graph multiple times with different color codings for different conditions. But then we have this problem that the graphs get increasingly small and it's also hard to compare. But this is like a feasible approach. Another one is data-driven node positioning. So here we kind of like don't do a force-directed layout or something like this, but we lay the nodes out by the parameters. And this is a video that shows this technique.
In this video, we present GraphDice, a system to visualize multivariate social networks that supports easy and flexible navigation in network attribute space. In the main visualization window, an overview matrix presents all possible attribute combination plots as graphs. The user can focus on a subset of nodes by creating graphic queries of different colors. She makes a lasso selection to create and refine selections through usual Boolean operations, as in Photoshop. Multiple queries can be activated at a given time to mark different groups of interest, like the strong connected communities the user has highlighted in this co-authorship network. The user can then explore how the community actors are spread from the point of view of other attributes by selecting a new plot in the navigation matrix. There is a 3D animated transition between the nodes and the lengths of the current plot to the new plot, as well as for the convex hulls that correspond to the queries, keeping one attribute dimension consistent during the animation. The user also has the option to control the speed of the 3D animation by invoking a menu with the left mouse button, back and forth.
So I don't want to dwell along in that video, but the idea here is that instead of laying our nodes out so that they show us the structure of the graph perfectly, we kind of compromise and lay the nodes out based on their x and y attributes. So this is an example of a fixed layout, but then we can read something into the x position and the y position of each node, and we show the connections by drawing these edges. And obviously, as in any fixed layout, that kind of leads to difficulties in understanding the topology, and that's why you need these different perspectives, to show the different attributes, and then you probably want to have one of these attributes might be something with an optimal or with like a traditional force-directed layout. This is a technique that we have developed to address the same problem with a little bit of a trick and some restrictions, of course. So here we have a network, and what we did is it's really hard to show these color codings on top of this network. So what we did instead is we let the user select one path in that network, because very often it's not that you need to see every attribute of the whole network, but you really care about one process, or one subpart of the network. And then if a user selects that, we can actually extract this path here, try to preserve as much of the contextual topology here, so we can see that this is the path from A to D to E, but we can also see that B is an incoming node to A, that here this intermediate node goes to C, and then we have a node that goes out of F. So that's kind of here in the structure, but we can't see that B has a relationship to C here in that case. But now that we have this linear layout, we can actually show data about those nodes in a table. And we can group that if we want to based on different data types and so on. And then we can juxtapose it with other data about these individual items that I can show here. So how does this look in practice? So this is one of those biological networks, and then I can select a path here, this actually goes through the cell border, I select 4 of those nodes, and the technique extracts those 4 nodes and shows us experimental data about those nodes. So we can see that there is lots of data of 2 different types about those nodes. We can extend that path selection, and then the technique would automatically also extend that and show us the attributes about those nodes. And so here you can essentially interactively look at what is going on with respect to the attributes in a single path. And this is an interactive demo of this, where you can see this also does some navigation between different graph partitions. That's not really the focus what I want to show here. You should look at the right side here where this path is being extracted. And then you can, if you want to look at the experimental data, you can look at this here in detail, do any kinds of sorting operations if you want to, and then judge any correlations. So this is like a detailed view of this. I showed this before about tailor visualizations, but it actually is a graph visualization technique. So here we have this selected path with lots of incoming and outgoing nodes, and then lots of detailed information about those individual nodes. And this is just to show you that these kinds of things, they look pretty complicated, but here's an important finding that some of our collaborators had with this. So this is a cancer data set. We're looking at a breast cancer data set and the response of 2 drugs. So we can see this is a signaling pathway that is important in cancer. And then we know that there's 2 known drugs that have, like this is a curve of IC50 values. So those values essentially, when they're low, they tell us that the drug works for this particular cell type or for this cell line. So you want low bars. We see that there seems to be a correlation of high values here in this RB2, which is at the cell border, but it's not as important, to whether this drug works for those people. So everybody who has a high value here, they seem to have this drug working. And then here, the same, like who have red, here, this drug seems to be working. But there's 2 outliers here, like this one and this one. They have high values, but the drug is not working, so the bar is high here. And so our collaborators were wondering, why is that happening? And the reason for that is that it's a network effect. Further downstream in the network, a gene that is like 5 steps away from that original gene up there is deregulated, is shut off down here. And so that drug cannot properly influence that pathway anymore. And that's why this drug doesn't work for those 2 cases. And so this is kind of like a pretty intricate example of how this joint analysis of attributes about a network and the topology of the network can help you understand of what is going on in such a complicated case. This is also a technique we developed for multivariate networks. In this case, it's similar to this connected China. We didn't try to visualize the whole network, but we tried to essentially let people query super large networks and ask specific questions about it. So, for example, if you have a large network of potential terrorists, locations, and actions that they did, and you have all these relationships, you don't want to see everything, right? You want to ask targeted questions. So how are 2 suspects connected? Or how is this one suspect connected to this place? Something like this. And so you formulate queries, like how are those 2 people connected? Or you can say, how are these do those 2 genes interact? Or how do those people, those 2 academics, how are they connected? Have they published together? So these are the kinds of questions that you can ask in the network. And so what we did here is we essentially ran a query for path that connected those people, but then we show the results only. So that makes our graph a lot smaller and therefore much more feasible to visualize. And then we show them both as a node link diagram with a free layout, but also as a ranked list of result path. And so here we now have like, this is one connection and this is the other connection. And the benefit of this ranked list is that I now can actually show lots of attributes about those people, like how old are they, what school are they in, and so on. That's now easy to juxtapose here on top of those people. And then I can like develop any kind of ranking function, like for example, the length of the path. I want to see the shortest path at the top, or I want to see the path with the strongest connections on the top. Anything like that. I can essentially come up with scores to show like the path that I care the most about on top. And so in this case, the second path here would be on top, and I would have to reorder the path to see the top path at the top. So here is an example of a co-author network. So we run a query in this query interface. This is implemented in D3 in the backend. It uses Neo4j graph database and a couple of custom path search algorithms. And so you can see here a ranked list. Right now it's ranked by the distance, just by the node distance. And here we see an overview of all those people. So we can quite clearly see that this here is useful to judge what are the central nodes. So for example, this person here connects a large swath of people here. This person here essentially is not that important to that network. Whereas here we can clearly see the different attributes about those people. And so here is just like how we represented those attributes about those people. We have numerical attributes, and we also have set relationships. And these set relationships are papers. And so we can show both of them on top of that. And we can also show you distributions of values for larger sets of experimental data, and so on. So there's lots of possibilities. That's a similar use case again as I showed before for this genetics use case. Okay, so next I wanted to talk about matrix representation. So we've talked about explicit layouts and then about multivariate networks. For explicit layouts, now let's talk about matrix representations. So in this little exercise that we did, we saw how the matrix works, and it's basically very simple, right? We build a matrix of all the nodes in the rows and all the nodes in the columns, and then we fill in the rectangle when there's an edge between the two of them. They take some getting used to think about them, but then they're for certain tasks they're kind of very useful. So here's just a couple of examples of topological structures and how they look like in a matrix. So a star corresponds to a row. This essentially bipartite partitioning here is this like cluster here. Here we have more general structures that you can see. And also remember that these are directed examples. And if you have, you can represent both directed and undirected networks in these matrices. And you simply do that. If you have an undirected network, it's symmetric. You essentially fill in both from E to D as from D to E. If you have a directed network, you have one side is from, the other side is to. So you have a node from A to B, then you have that essentially in the one side of the matrix shows you the one directionality, and the other mirror side of the matrix shows you the other directionality. So in this case, A to B and B to A would be separate, would have separate meanings. The graph matrix representations are really well suited for neighborhood-related topology-based tasks. So all of the neighbors of the node B are super easy to find, right? It's B, C, and D. But they're not suited for path-related topology-based tasks. So for example, how is A connected to B? That is really hard to do with a matrix. I always have to sit down with a pencil and then trace it manually. So that's really not well supported by matrices. Here's another example of a couple of graph structures and how they would look like in a matrix. And as in any matrix, the order is critical. And so this is this Les Miserables network that we saw. And here it's now ordered by name. And then we can sort it by by cluster. So this is by the chapters in the books, or automatically clustered, I don't actually remember, or by the frequency of how often they are mentioned. And so we can see quite different structures in each of these representations. And so this is very sensitive to the layout. So the pros of matrix representations is that they can represent all graph classes except for hypergraphs. But they put the focus on the edge set. So it's easy to show edge weights in a matrix because I can simply, for example, color code the weight. One other benefit is they're super simple to do. We don't have a complicated force-directed layout that has not an ideal runtime complexity. It's simply a matrix layout. They're well suited for attribute-based tasks on edges via coloring of matrix cells. And they're well suited for neighborhood-related topology-based tasks via simply traversing rows or columns. But they need a lot of space. And so these networks that I showed you have maybe 50 nodes, this Les Miserables network, and that's kind of already the upper limit here. And of course, they're not suited for topology-based tasks. A special case of such a matrix layout is a genealogy graph. So this is a genealogy of the Simpsons. You can see Marge and Homer here, Bart, Maggie, and Lisa, Patty and Selma, and then the grandparents of Marge and Homer, or the parents of Marge and Homer up there. And so the way this works is that a nuclear family is always represented in one column here. So you can see that Marge, Selma, and Patty are the daughters of Jacqueline and Clancy, versus Mona and Abraham are the parents of Homer. And then Bart, Maggie, and Lisa are just the children of Marge and Homer. And so this is like an interesting technique because these genealogies get pretty complex and pretty big. And so by structuring it like this, in this matrix layout, you can get a good overview of what is going on in these families. And then people also have developed hybrids between explicit and matrices. Like matrices are great for super dense connected subgraphs, but they don't really scale so well. So people figured, well, let's just represent a densely connected subgraph as a matrix, and then show these connections here with these links between these subgraphs. Yeah, I already mentioned that. Here's a hierarchization of the representation that kind of aims to address the problem of the quadratic string space so that you kind of can collapse that a little bit. So in here we create those three groups and then represent, essentially we could collapse it at any of those levels. So there's other techniques to kind of address this problem with distortions and selections and so on. But I'm going to skip over them because they're not super relevant in practice. And so next I wanted to talk about trees and have an exercise, but it's already too late. So I'll do this in the next time. I'll be lecturing myself. And then I'll see you guys all on Thursday for the guest lecture. Thanks.